Our second reading today is again from the Old Testament. If you want to follow in the Pew Bible, it'll be page 1048. It's from the prophet Amos, chapter 7, verses 7 through 15. It's a small piece of a conflict between Amos and the prophet, the high priest Amaziah. The religious establishment led by Amaziah is not happy with Amos's message, and they just literally want him to go away. So as we begin our text today, Amos is speaking. This is what God showed to me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. And we have a change in setting. Amaziah now complains to the king. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to the king Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel, and the land is not able to bear his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from this land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman, a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and he said to me, go, prophesy to my people Israel. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Christ. I can relate to Amos. I think Amos is an interesting character. I can just see Amos, the old farmer, standing there in the middle of the temple. Maybe he's on a orange crate or something, lecturing to the people. I just think I'd like that guy. Although Amos is from the southern kingdom, from Judah, he's actually prophesying in the northern kingdom, Israel, during a long and expansive reign of King Jeroboam II. Now, this would have been about 700 years before Christ, and this was a very prosperous time for Israel. The passage for today comes from the middle of the prophet Amos's story. It is the third of three visions against Israel that God has Amos deliver. The first, Amos sees locusts eating away the spring growth. The second, Amos sees a shower of fire consuming the land. And then finally, our reading today, Amos sees a wall built with a plumb line. Now, this vision goes further than the others when God speaks to and questions poor Amos. God asks Amos, what do you see? Amos, I can see him trembling before God, saying, God, what I see is a plumb line. But he knows, we know, God is not concerned about the straightness of some mere stone wall. God has a different sort of application of that plumb line in mind. If we back up for a minute and look at the larger picture, God has the prophet Amos raising concern about the concentration of wealth among the mostly urban elite at the expense of the poor. In other parts of the book, he repeatedly refers to their luxury goods as indicators of their moral decay. Picture Amos, the farmer turned prophet, in the temple of Bethel. There he stands shouting to the crowd. Listen to a modern language translation of his words from back earlier in chapter 6, when he mocks their luxuries. Woe to those who live in luxury and expect everyone to serve them. Woe to those who live only for today, indifferent to the fate of others. Woe to the playboys and playgirls who think life is a party just held for them. Woe to those addicted to feeling good, life without pain, those obsessed with looking good, life without wrinkles. They could not care less about their country going to ruin. With that type of statement, I doubt Amos was a real popular guy with the elite. Amos points out the material prosperity for the elite seems to have come at the expense of the poor, and points to a growing gap between the rural poor and the wealthier landowners. In another part, he says of the elite, they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, they who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Economic injustice, structural and systemic injustice that perpetrates social inequality. This is the central concern back 700 years before Christ. Yet, economic injustice is also a very current message for us today as we listen to Amos's words. In our particular reading for today, God presents Amos with a common tool with a clear purpose. As we talked about, the plumb line functions to keep the wall vertically straight during construction. It helps maintain the integrity of the building by providing a vertical reference point. Of course, it can also be used to test whether the wall is shifted over time as well. The obvious metaphor is that God is setting a religious and ethical plumb line in the midst of the kingdom of Israel to see how they stand. The result is that the people fail to measure up. As demonstrated by the plumb line, as proclaimed by Amos, they are not standing upright. Here, as well as elsewhere in the book of Amos, God roars for justice. God's deep concern for human injustice is expressed through Amos in the language of judgment and threat. In chapter 3, we hear Amos shout, "The lion has roared, who will not fear? The Lord has spoken, who can but prophesy?" In our text today, Amos hears God say and repeats to the world to hear, "The shrines of Isaac will be made desolate, the holy places of Israel will be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword." God is angry. Therefore, God will allow destruction of the high places of worship and violence against King Jeroboam's house. The punishment highlights the exact elements within the Israelite culture that do not measure up. But God is not angry for the sake of being angry, and neither is God's anger in conflict with God's love. As theologian James Cone writes, most theological treatments of God's love fail to place the proper emphasis on God's wrath, suggesting that love is completely self-giving without any demand for obedience. Famous World War II era theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called this cheap grace. As Amos is so keen to show us, God is not indifferent to human suffering, oppression, and injustice. Cone goes on, the wrath of God is the love of God in regard or in respect to the forces opposed to liberation of the oppressed. Amos tells of the judgment of God for Israel's failure to fulfill its moral obligations to God, to the liberation of the oppressed. Judgment is that King Jeroboam will die by the sword and Israel will go into exile. God's love does not accept indifference towards the oppressed. Then Amaziah, the high priest of Bethel, without response from his king, confronts the outsider Amos. Amaziah is outraged at Amos's message for sure. After all, look at it from his perspective. He is the high priest. He is the religious authority who speaks on behalf of the temple as well as the king. Amaziah views he and the king as being in charge. Amaziah in this text is the ultimate insider. He has vested interest in institutional stability on his terms. He cannot tolerate judgment against the king. He would say the holy place of Bethel belongs to the king and to his kingdom. Amaziah is supported by the king. This makes Amos' message just plain intolerable to both Amaziah and the king. I would simply note that Amaziah's reaction is much like our common first reactions. We are always the most upset at our prophets when they seem to question our way of life, not necessarily when they question the action of those with whom we disagree. At this point, Amaziah tells, or more likely orders, Amos to go make his living as a professional prophet elsewhere. Go back down to that southern kingdom where you came from. I can just see Amos's response, humbly saying, "But sir, I am not a professional prophet. In fact, I am not from the line of prophets. I do not get legitimacy through prophetic ancestors. This is not a business or a livelihood for me. My prophetic words come from God, who called me while I was tending my flock, called me to be a prophet to Israel. I cannot just pack up and move to the next city. God took me from my day job as a herdsman and a sycamore tree dresser, sent me with a message to Israel." It might be easy for us in our daily lives to identify with Amos, the unheralded, unwanted prophet in his own land. We may find ourselves saying, "But nobody wants to listen to me, nobody listens to me." But in reality, if we are honest with ourselves, aren't we more like Amaziah? We both individually and as a church, like him, are committed to causes we believe in. We see this as a good thing, and basically it is. Yet, aren't we like Amaziah, loath to see them change or fail for any reason? The big challenge comes when we ask, are we the insiders? So much that we cannot hear the voice of the prophet around us. Are we numb to those whose voices sounding from the outside need urgently to be heard, yet we do not hear? Do we hear Amos in our day? Now, I can't pass preaching from the book of Prophet Amos without taking some acknowledgement that Amos's emphasis on systemic social injustice made him a favorite of Martin Luther King Jr. In his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, King writes to the well-intentioned white pastors who have urged King not to act too quickly, not to push his agenda for racial equality and with urgency, and not to employ strategies of civil disobedience. King, in response, calls for extremism. Hear his words, including his quote from the prophet Amos. King says, What was not Jesus an extremist for love? Did he not say, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despise you and persecute you? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? When Amos said, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. For us, this text from Amos is a searching call for self-reflection and commitment. Now, I would note one specific opportunity for us as a congregation for such reflection and commitment. I would remind us that in September of 2019, before all this COVID-19 stuff distracted us, we made a commitment to be part of the PCUSA movement called Matthew 25. As part of Matthew 25 commitment, we pledged to embrace 3 areas of focus: building congregational vitality by deepening and emerging our faith and energizing our faith and growing as joyful leaders and disciples actively engaged with our community as we share the gospel of Jesus Christ in word and deed, building congregational vitality. Second, we committed to dismantling structural racism by fearlessly applying our faith to advocate and break down the systems, practices, and thinking that underlie discrimination, bias, prejudice, and oppression of people of color, dismantling structural racism. The third was eradicating systemic poverty by acting on our beliefs and working to change laws, policies, plans, and structure in our society that perpetuate economic exploitation of people who are poor, eradicating systemic poverty. Those 3 commitments still stand: building congregational vitality, dismantling structural racism, eradicating systemic poverty. I would also point out to session members and committee leadership, and really all of us, that one tool for us to reflect and re-energize our work in these areas is our church action plan. We have committed to it as a church action plan, and it's currently under review by our various committees in session. Maybe you can even hear Amos cheering behind the screen in the background as we plan together to update our church plan. Well, let me conclude. Amos was and continues to be quite an interesting character. Claimed not to be a real prophet like those expected in his day. Claimed that God called him from his everyday service to bring a message to Israel. Interestingly, the establishment did not argue with his message. They just told him to go away, which he did not. Authentic ministry, someone has said, ought to comfort the afflicted, but also afflict the comfortable. In Amos, we see one half of this model of authentic ministry. Amos' message came in Amos's message comes words for us to ponder in our own ministry, in our own time. Amos seemed to have little optimism for God's people. He was a prophet of doom and gloom, afflicting the comfortable. Well, it's summer, and we see the beauty of most days and even some beauty in the rain today. After such harshness, let's not forget Amos's message, but close with the contrast by going back to our psalm for today for a bit of comforting the afflicted. Let us use it as a closing prayer, as our comfort. Let us pray. Let me hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace to his people, to his faithful, to those who turn to him in their hearts. Surely his salvation is at hand for those who fear him, that his glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. The Lord will give what is good, and the land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before him and will make a path for his steps. Afflicting the comfortable, comforting the afflicted. Both are our mission. Amen.